Imagine being 13 years old and discovering you're pregnant. Now imagine that pregnancy occurring in 1457, when childbirth could easily mean death, and the father of your child has just been killed in battle. Finally, imagine that the baby growing inside you will one day become the King of England, founding a dynasty that will rule for over a century. This isn't a work of fiction. This is the extraordinary true story of Lady Margaret Beaufort, a girl who became a woman far too soon, a mother who would move heaven and earth for her son, and a political mastermind who helped reshape the English throne forever. Lady Margaret Beaufort's name might not be as familiar as Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth I, but her impact on English history was arguably greater than both. Born into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, she would survive 4 marriages, countless political upheavals, and personal tragedies that would have broken most people. Yet through it all, she maintained an unwavering focus on one goal: securing the throne for her son, Henry Tudor. Her story begins not with triumph, but with a childhood stolen and a burden no 13-year-old should ever bear. Margaret Beaufort was born around 1443 into one of England's most powerful families. As the great-great-granddaughter of Edward III, she carried royal blood in her veins, a blessing that would prove to be both her greatest asset and her heaviest curse. In medieval England, noble girls were often viewed as political pawns, and Margaret was no exception. By the age of 6, she had been betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. When that arrangement fell through due to political maneuvering, she found herself promised to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, in 1455. She was barely 12 years old when she married this man who was twice her age. What followed would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Within months of their marriage, Margaret was pregnant, but before she could even comprehend the full weight of impending motherhood, tragedy struck. Edmund Tudor died of plague in November 1456, leaving his child bride widowed and carrying their unborn child. Margaret was now 13, alone, and facing the most dangerous experience a woman of her era could endure: childbirth. In the 15th century, approximately 1 in 3 women died during or shortly after giving birth. For someone as young as Margaret, the risks were even higher. On January 28, 1457, in the forbidding walls of Pembroke Castle in Wales, 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort went into labor. The birth was traumatic beyond imagination. Medieval medical knowledge was primitive, and Margaret's young body was barely developed enough to handle pregnancy, let alone childbirth. Hours of agony passed. The castle's stone walls seemed to echo with her cries as she fought for both her life and her child's. When the baby finally arrived, a son, Margaret lay between life and death for days. The trauma was so severe that she would never bear another child, despite having 3 more marriages. They named the baby Henry Tudor. Neither mother nor child knew it then, but this tiny, struggling infant would one day defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field and become Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. But survival was just the beginning of Margaret's challenges. As a teenage widow with a baby, she was incredibly vulnerable in the brutal world of medieval politics. The Wars of the Roses were tearing England apart, and everyone with even a distant claim to the throne was either a potential ally or a deadly threat. Understanding her precarious position, Margaret made a decision that must have torn her heart apart. She allowed her son Henry to be raised by his uncle Jasper Tudor, while she remarried for protection. Her second husband was Sir Henry Stafford, and later, after his death, she married Thomas Stanley. Each marriage was a calculated move in the dangerous game of medieval politics. Margaret's genius lay not in military might or charismatic leadership, but in her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court intrigue. She was a master of the long game, always thinking several moves ahead. While others fought openly for power, Margaret worked in the shadows, building networks, forming alliances, and always keeping her son's interests at heart. When Edward IV seized the throne from Henry VI, Margaret adapted. When Richard III took power after the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower, Margaret saw opportunity where others saw only danger. She began to position her son Henry as a legitimate alternative to Richard's rule. The separation from Henry was agony for Margaret. Letters between mother and son reveal a deep, abiding love and concern. Margaret wrote to him of politics, of strategy, of the need for caution. She sent him money, clothes, and most importantly, hope. For years, Henry lived in exile in Brittany, always looking over his shoulder, always aware that assassins might be lurking in the shadows. By 1483, Margaret had endured enough. Richard III alleged murder of the princes in the Tower had horrified England, and opposition to his rule was growing. Margaret saw her moment and seized it with both hands. In one of history's most audacious political maneuvers, Margaret began secretly coordinating what would become Buckingham's rebellion. She used her position as the wife of Thomas Stanley, one of Richard III's supporters, to gather intelligence and funding for her son's cause. She smuggled money to Henry in Brittany and worked to convince other nobles to support his claim to the throne. The rebellion failed, and Margaret faced the very real possibility of execution for treason. Richard III stripped her of her lands and titles, but remarkably spared her life, perhaps not wanting to make a martyr of such a prominent noblewoman. Instead, he placed her under house arrest under her husband's supervision. But Richard had underestimated Margaret Beaufort. Even under house arrest, she continued to plot and plan. She established a network of spies and supporters throughout England, all working toward one goal: bringing her son home to claim his throne. On August 22, 1485, 28 years after giving birth to Henry in agony and terror, Margaret Beaufort watched her son face Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Everything she had worked for, schemed for, and sacrificed for came down to this single day. When Richard III fell and Henry Tudor was proclaimed Henry VII, Margaret's extraordinary gamble had paid off. The boy she had almost died bringing into the world was now King of England. The traumatic birth at Pembroke Castle had produced not just a child, but a dynasty. Margaret's joy must have been overwhelming, but she was too seasoned a political operator to rest on her laurels. She immediately set about securing her son's position, arranging his marriage to Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York, and establishing the administrative systems that would make the Tudor dynasty one of England's most successful royal houses. Henry VII never forgot what his mother had done for him. He granted her unprecedented power for a woman of her time, and she effectively served as his chief advisor. Margaret had gone from a terrified 13-year-old girl to one of the most powerful women in England. Margaret's influence didn't end with Henry's coronation. She became the matriarch of the Tudor court, a formidable presence who commanded respect from nobles, courtiers, and even foreign ambassadors. She was deeply involved in the education of her grandson, the future Henry VIII, and her influence can be seen in the administrative efficiency that characterized early Tudor rule. But perhaps most remarkably, Margaret never stopped learning and growing. She became deeply religious, founding colleges at Cambridge University and supporting educational initiatives throughout England. She was a patron of scholars and artists, helping to usher in the Renaissance in England. She also maintained strict control over court protocol and ceremony, understanding that pageantry and tradition were essential to maintaining royal authority. Margaret had learned the hard way that power was fragile, and she was determined to create institutions and traditions that would protect the Tudor dynasty for generations to come. Margaret Beaufort died in 1509, just days after watching her grandson Henry VIII be crowned king. She had lived to see not just her son become king, but to witness the establishment of a dynasty that would include some of England's most famous monarchs, including Elizabeth I. Her legacy extends far beyond her famous descendants. Margaret fundamentally changed the role of women in English politics. She proved that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking could be more powerful than armies or noble birth. She showed that a woman could wield significant political power even in a male-dominated society, paving the way for future queens and female political figures. Her story also demonstrates the incredible power of a mother's love. Everything Margaret achieved was motivated by her desire to protect and advance her son's interests. The traumatic experience of giving birth at 13, nearly dying in the process, and being separated from her child for years, forged an unbreakable bond that shaped English history. But Margaret's story wasn't without its shadows. Her political maneuvering sometimes required ruthless decisions. She supported her son's claim even when it meant opposing other legitimate claimants to the throne. Her rise to power came at the expense of others who had equal or better claims to royal authority. The trauma of her early experiences also left lasting scars. Margaret's relationships were often calculated rather than emotional. Her later marriages appear to have been primarily political arrangements. The teenage girl who had suffered so much became a woman who trusted few people completely and who always kept her ultimate goals clearly in mind. Some historians argue that Margaret's influence on Henry VII contributed to his reputation as a miserly and suspicious king. The mother who had fought so hard to put her son on the throne may have instilled in him an excessive caution about threats to his authority. Margaret Beaufort's story raises profound questions that resonate even today. What happens to a child forced to become an adult before their time? How do traumatic experiences shape our character and our choices? And what are the limits of what a parent should do for their child? Margaret's teenage pregnancy and traumatic childbirth were the defining experiences of her life. Everything she did afterward can be traced back to that terrifying day at Pembroke Castle. The girl who almost died bringing Henry into the world spent the rest of her life ensuring that his birth would matter. Her story also highlights the incredible vulnerability of women in medieval society and their remarkable capacity for resilience. Margaret transformed from victim to victor, from powerless teenager to one of the most influential women in English history. Today, when we think of the Tudors, we picture Henry VIII larger-than-life personality or Elizabeth I golden age. But none of it would have existed without the courage of a 13-year-old girl who refused to let tragedy define her destiny. Margaret Beaufort's story reminds us that history often turns on the most human of experiences: love, fear, determination, and the unbreakable bond between parent and child. The teenage mother who nearly died in childbirth became the architect of one of England's greatest dynasties. Her life spans one of the most turbulent periods in English history, from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses to the stability of early Tudor rule. Through it all, she remained focused on a goal that must have seemed impossible when she first held her newborn son, making him a king. Margaret Beaufort proved that sometimes the most unlikely people change the world. The pregnant 13-year-old who faced death to bring Henry Tudor into the world ultimately gave England a dynasty that would rule for over a century and produce some of its most memorable monarchs. In the end, Margaret's story is more than just historical fact. It's a testament to the power of determination, the strength of maternal love, and the truth that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements begin with the most ordinary human experiences. The girl who was forced to grow up too soon grew up to change history itself. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.